I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 81, Development. Luo Wen casually tossed a small black beetle into his mouth, followed by the others, ensuring he fully absorbed their genetic traits. Having acquired what he needed, Luo Wen wasted no time returning to the brood nest. Of the 500 new generation queen ants ordered, 200 had already been produced. Luo Wen promptly integrated the newly acquired genetic fragments into the remaining queen's genetic database, securing a foundation for his aquatic unit production base. As time passed, the 200 matured queen ants were transported to the front lines, where they were needed to manage a massive big-headed ant nest. The original big-headed ant queen and surviving worker ants, after demonstrating their utility, were consumed. The plantation, left untended, desperately needed new caretakers. 300 older queen ants stationed near the area were reassigned throughout the big-headed ant territory, as the region was fraught with peril, bordered by over a dozen red ant nests. Previously, the swarm's forces had been dangerously thin, making a large-scale red ant invasion difficult to repel. However, the swarm's strength across its 3,000 bases ensured that troop replenishment could be accomplished swiftly. With forces in the region now exceeding 2 million, any red ant incursions, unless united on a massive scale, would be suicidal. With the new queens in place, swarm cultivators were rapidly hatched and gradually assumed control of the plantation. Despite their efforts, labor shortages persisted, given the plantation's size large enough to sustain 7 million big-headed ants and the delicate nature of the fungal crops. Fortunately, the older worker ants, based on the black ant template, unexpectedly demonstrated an ability to manage the plantation. Whether this was due to their learning capacity or some other factor, they quickly adapted to farming duties. This eliminated the need to wait for the new worker ants modeled on the big-headed ant template. Large numbers of the older worker ants were reassigned to the big-headed ant nest, greatly alleviating the labor shortage. As the new queens matured, they were initially intended to support the front lines. However, with the older worker ants taking over the plantations, the new queens were directed elsewhere. New bases were established along the lake and river banks. Swarms of aquatic soldiers began deploying into the water. Resembling inverted boats, these units varied in size. Smaller versions matched the original beetles at 2–3 centimeters in length, while larger ones, measuring up to half a meter, dwarfed even the giant scorpion, making them the largest swarm units aside from Luo Wen himself. These massive aquatic units were produced in limited quantities and primarily served as transport vessels, ferrying scout bugs across the river. Future large-scale production would depend on situational needs. For the time being, the swarm ceased territorial expansion. With the integration of agricultural systems, the swarm's carrying capacity had significantly increased. Burrower ants were added back into the production lineup, with large numbers hatched to assist in reconfiguring existing bases. Thanks to their efforts, the original bases were reorganized. Spiral corridors were added, and new plantations were excavated, modeled entirely after the big-headed ant nest. The big-headed ants, with their long history in agriculture, were far more specialized than Luo Wen. For example, he had long wondered about the numerous small holes dotting the top of their nest. After taking over their nest and experimenting, he discovered these were ventilation shafts. The fungal crops generated significant heat during growth. If this heat wasn't expelled, it would harm both the crops and the ants. The spiral corridors, chamber designs, and ventilation shafts were integral to this heat management system. Until the nest structure and potential hidden functions were fully understood, Luo Wen decided to replicate it entirely, refining his knowledge through practice. In the following days, the swarm entered a period of steady development. The Northern Army ceased exploration, and the other two armies slowed their advance. The new agricultural system required significant manpower. While it took the big-headed ants an unknown amount of time to build up their numbers, the swarm could capitalize on its innate advantages. Luo Wen ordered a new batch of queen ants 2,000 in total. These queens would not have their own territories but would instead act as production tools, replenishing manpower across existing bases. This was only a temporary measure. Once the agricultural system was perfected and labor shortages resolved, the swarm would resume its expansion. At that point, these queens would receive their own territories. By then, there would be not just 3 armies but a fourth, a new eastern army that would cross the river to claim new lands. The river, now dominated by the swarm, would no longer impede their expansion. Time passed, and Luo Wen, his energy refocused, settled into a period of calm. Transport bugs departed the former big-headed ant nest, distributing fungal crop seeds to various bases. As the plantations at each base were established and began producing, the swarm's population grew rapidly. Previously, each base averaged 5,000 members, now, they housed 30,000 on average, a number far from their limit. With over 3,000 bases, the swarm's population approached 100 million, a staggering figure. With such numbers, the swarm would no longer engage in a grueling battle against a big-headed ant nest but would instead crush it outright. During this time, 5 red ant nests near the former big-headed ant territory invaded swarm lands. Luo Wen effortlessly mobilized 5 million troops from nearby bases, launching direct assaults on the red ant nests, reducing them to protein stores and claiming their territories, no subterfuge required. The overwhelming defeats made these battles joyless for Luo Wen. As the swarm grew ever stronger, the known enemies posed little challenge. Perhaps only the Yellow Earth Ant Legion, with its plague-like numbers, could provide a worthy fight. Despite his growing confidence, Luo Wen remained pragmatic. While the swarm had become far stronger, it still lagged several tiers behind the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. To contend with them, the swarm needed more time to develop. But with the swarm's potential, Luo Wen was confident that this time would be short. Chapter 82, Experimentation, 1. While Luo Wen idled with little to do, his aquatic units patrolling the river stumbled upon a new type of insect. They captured it successfully and delivered it to Luo Wen. At first glance, the insect resembled the small black beetle discovered earlier, but it was dark brown, with a slightly flattened head and a prominent shoulder plate, something the black beetle lacked. Additionally, this insect had only one pair of eyes, setting it apart from the earlier species. Like the black beetle, it had 3 pairs of legs, but its front legs were shorter and stubbier. The middle and rear legs, though paddle-like, were covered with dense bristles. The scout that captured it could not explain where it had come from, only that it was found in the river. Observing the paddle-like legs, Luo Wen speculated that it was another water-skimming insect, similar to the black beetle, capable of moving across the water's surface. With little concern, he casually consumed it. What he didn't expect was the surprise this tiny insect had in store for him. That very night, Luo Wen entered a cocoon state, his body undergoing significant structural changes. When he finally emerged from his cocoon, the first thing Luo Wen did was eat, refueling his ravenous body. As he ate, he inspected himself. However, as he examined his body, he became increasingly puzzled. Outwardly, there didn't seem to be any significant changes. He raised his paddle-like hind legs, noticing that they now seemed slightly hairier. Could this be the change? But this adaptation had appeared earlier, after consuming the black beetle. Previously, his last pair of legs had transformed into paddle-shaped appendages. While awkward at first, Luo Wen had grown used to them. With his 6 remaining standard legs, he could still move effortlessly on land, scaling mountains and trees without issue. The earlier transformation had been a simple molt, not requiring cocooning. So why had he entered a cocoon this time? Could a few extra hairs trigger such a drastic change? Luo Wen shook his head, dismissing the idea. His body only cocooned during major transformations, this much he knew. If the change wasn't external, then it had to be internal. He headed to the brood nest to investigate. Sure enough, a new set of genetic fragments, related to respiratory systems, had been added to the genetic library clearly derived from the small brown insect. Given the insect's diminutive size, its respiratory system wasn't designed for a larger body. Thus, its usefulness likely lay elsewhere. To understand its function, Luo Wen could simply have the brood nest produce some eggs based on the new genetic template. However, developing eggs into mature insects would take time, and Luo Wen was impatient for answers. Despite this, he still instructed the brood nest to produce some eggs using the new genetic data and updated the queen ant production orders with the new genes. Then, Luo Wen hurried to the river's aquatic base. The so-called aquatic base was nothing more than a simple lakeside station. Due to the muddy soil and high moisture, the area was unsuitable for a permanent nest, so no queen ants were stationed there. Such outposts dotted the lakeshore and riverbank, functioning as makeshift docks. Luo Wen arrived at the station where the small brown insect had been discovered. Near the base, small aquatic units modeled on the black beetle were gathered, familiarizing themselves with their abilities. These raft bugs, named for their inverted boat-like appearance, had been hatched using the black beetle's template. Their compact bodies skimmed the water surface effortlessly, resembling miniature boats. As this was a lakeside base, most of the raft bugs here were small in size. Their limited propulsion made them unsuitable for navigating the river's swift currents. The small brown insect had been captured by these raft bugs, though its origin remained a mystery. Luo Wen had patrolled the lakeshore countless times without ever encountering such a species. After another day of searching the area, Luo Wen found nothing. Impatient for answers, he decided to experiment personally. Since gaining paddle-shaped legs, Luo Wen had avoided entering the water. Now, with his curiosity piqued, he wasn't about to risk plunging into the lake. Despite being the largest raft bug in the swarm, he had his own precautions. He summoned over 1,000,000 burrower ants and 5 giant scorpions to the lake. The giant scorpions, with their prowess in excavation, had proven invaluable for large-scale projects. After battles, Luo Wen had replenished their numbers to maintain this capability. In peacetime, they subsisted on minimal resources, awaiting tasks. At Luo Wen's command, they began digging. He marked out a small area to excavate an 80-centimeter deep swimming pool. Standing over a meter tall with his legs extended, Luo Wen deemed this depth safe. The assembled workforce, adept at digging and burrowing, completed the pool in a single day. Under Luo Wen's guidance, they then dug a channel connecting the pool to the lake. As lake water flowed in, the pool gradually filled. With preparations complete, Luo Wen cautiously stepped into the water. Slowly, he retracted his legs one by one, folding them beneath his body. To his delight, he floated on the surface. Testing the paddle-like legs, he felt a push of water propelling him forward. Unfortunately, the pool's small size limited his movement. He reached the far edge after only a few strokes. Undeterred, Luo Wen reveled in the novelty of the experience. For the first time, he was truly amphibious. After some time, he remembered his purpose. Concentrating on his body's sensations in the water, Luo Wen suddenly, instinctively, dove beneath the surface. The water rippled violently as Luo Wen submerged. Waves rebounded against the pool's edges before settling into calm. Half an hour passed without Luo Wen resurfacing, as though the pool had swallowed him. Beneath the water, a massive black insect crouched at the bottom. A visible air bubble clung to the tip of its abdomen, standing out starkly in the murky depths. This insect was Luo Wen. After half an hour of experimentation, he had deciphered the purpose of his newly enhanced respiratory system. Chapter 83, Experimentation, 2. Luo Wen's body underwent slight structural changes, with a new air sac forming between his carapace and abdomen. When he submerged in water, this air sac functioned like an oxygen tank, connected to a valve on his abdomen. Fine steel hairs grew around the valve, acting like a filter to allow air to pass through while removing impurities. These impurities included water, enabling him to breathe underwater. When the air in the oxygen tank was nearly depleted, Luo Wen could press the air sac out from between his carapace and abdomen. Since water contained abundant dissolved oxygen and exerted significant pressure, the oxygen would naturally seep into the air bubble, allowing him to continue breathing. If he needed to move underwater, he could retract the air sac, with the oxygen inside sustaining him for a while. This was truly a fascinating ability. Although it wasn't the same as true aquatic respiration like fish, requiring periodic stops to replenish oxygen, this capability made underwater exploration feasible for Luo Wen. It seemed the swarm's aquatic forces were gaining a new unit. Previously, the raft bugs could only row across the water's surface without any diving ability. In addition, Luo Wen's eyes acquired a new function. While underwater, his eyes secreted a liquid that formed a thin film covering them, allowing him to see normally beneath the water. He climbed out of the pool and stepped into the lake, his body gradually sinking beneath the surface. Looking at the pitch-black lake bed in the distance, Luo Wen hesitated. In the end, he decided against venturing too far. The lake bed was an unknown risk, and diving alone without any support bugs nearby to assist if danger arose was overly reckless contrary to his naturally cautious disposition. After convincing himself, Luo Wen was satisfied with his decision. He climbed ashore and left without looking back. Under Luo Wen's deliberate planning, the upgraded queen ants were prioritized for deployment to build bases along the lakeshore after maturing in the main base. In truth, Luo Wen wasn't particularly eager to explore the underwater world. It was simply that recent days had been too monotonous, and he had entered one of those moods where he felt like seeking excitement, even at the risk of danger. During this time, the swarm base population had nearly doubled, reaching close to 50,000 members. However, days earlier, the Northern Army regrouped an 800,000 strong force to resume its march, first eliminating the nearby red ant nests surrounding the big-headed ant colony. The battles were completely one-sided, to the extent that Luo Wen didn't even bother to watch. Although they lost nearly 1,000,000 troops in direct frontal assaults, the casualties were replenished shortly after. The Northern Army then divided into dozens of smaller units to push forward. When encountering large ant colonies, they would regroup to annihilate the enemy and then disperse again after the battle. This tactic significantly increased the efficiency of their expansion. The more than 2,000 queen ants originally stationed near the main base were gradually deployed to the front lines to establish and defend new territories. The swarm's base count had approached 4,000. Due to the rapid expansion, the average population of each base dropped from 50,000 to 40,000, yet the swarm's total population exceeded 150 million. Recently, Luo Wen had also bolstered the Western and Central armies, whose troop counts had previously been under 100,000, far too meager compared to the Northern Army. Though the swarm was unwaveringly loyal and never questioned Luo Wen's commands, even tolerating blatant favoritism, Luo Wen himself felt guilty and decided to treat them more equally. With reinforcements gradually in place, these two armies also adopted the dispersed advance strategy, rapidly accelerating their progress. While Luo Wen had previously stockpiled a batch of queen ants without assigned bases, their numbers were dwindling fast with the current pace of deployment. Moreover, in the coming days, the newly formed aquatic swarm would ferry the Eastern Army across rivers and lakes to seize and develop new territories on the opposite shores. However, for now, the Eastern Army existed only in name, with no troops in place. The once abundant queen ant resources were now running low again. As a result, the brood nest had ceased producing other soldier types and was focusing entirely on hatching queen ants. Time passed, and the combined strength of the armies and the new advancement methods drastically accelerated the pace of expansion. The armies began outpacing the supply lines, creating logistical issues. Reluctantly, Luo Wen ordered them to slow their advance. All the queen ants originally gathered at the main base had been deployed, each with its own base to manage. With the swarm's resources stretched thin, even the retired queen ants were assigned full production tasks. Yet, despite such resource constraints, Luo Wen still hatched a 100,000 strong submersible bug unit. On a sunny, breezy day, the newly assembled underwater force gathered by the lake. At Luo Wen's command, the submersible bugs lined up and plunged into the water, creating a spectacular sight. Luo Wen followed them into the lake. Thanks to the pleasant weather, the lake unspoiled by the dreaded upright apes was crystal clear. The underwater visibility was excellent, easing Luo Wen's tension. Under his command, the submersible bugs surrounded him as they slowly descended to the lake bed. As they ventured deeper, the diminishing light made their surroundings increasingly dark. Soon, the swarm reached the bottom of the lake, approximately 20 meters below the surface. After roaming for a while without encountering any danger, the submersible bugs dispersed to explore in all directions. The lake bed was covered in black silt, with occasional smooth, patterned stones peeking through. Unfortunately, Luo Wen wasn't a fan of rare stones, so he paid them no mind. Dark green aquatic plants grew within the silt, their leaves covered with algae. Some submersible bugs prototypes hid among the plants, but their glimmering air bubbles made them conspicuous underwater. It turned out these creatures had always been lurking in the lake's depths, which explained why Luo Wen hadn't discovered them during his earlier investigations by the shore. Luo Wen spent an entire day surveying the lake bed. The deepest point, directly beneath a waterfall, was only about 30 meters deep. There were no hidden beasts, treasures, or even fish. While this outcome might have been the best a confirmation that the lake held no threats, Luo Wen couldn't help feeling disappointed. Perhaps he had hoped to find something to break the monotony of his current life. Chapter 84, Corncob. The long-awaited underwater exploration only lasted a single day, leaving Luo Wen regretting the decision to hatch a 100,000 strong aquatic army. With no other choice, he left a small contingent to occupy the underwater world, while the rest were sent downstream to explore the rivers. Perhaps they might discover something of interest along the way. Having made these arrangements, Luo Wen shifted his focus back to the operations of the swarm. Time flowed on, and hundreds of days and nights passed. Luo Wen had found new joy in watching the swarm's numbers continuously grow, giving him a peculiar sense of satisfaction. The swarm's territory expanded rapidly, with over 10,000 bases now established. Each base housed an average of about 100,000 insects, bringing the swarm's total population to over 1 billion. This figure was limited only by the fact that the queen ants' hatching rates couldn't keep up with the pace of territorial expansion. In newly occupied regions, the density of branch bases was far lower than in earlier stages of development. Consequently, the average population per base skyrocketed from 30,000 to 100,000 and continued to rise. Yet Luo Wen was still unsatisfied. The swarm now controlled two major technological industries, farming and cultivation. The food shortages that had once constrained the swarm's growth were no longer an issue. Ironically, the bottleneck in development was now production capacity. Queen ants could only be hatched in the brood nest, and the brood nest itself, due to its structure, had reached its maximum size with a fixed output. Previously capable of outproducing hundreds of queen ants, the brood nest was now struggling to keep pace. As for the queen ants themselves, their reproductive capacity was even more limited by their size. Even with constant work, their efficiency remained low. Improving the brood nest was currently impossible, so Luo Wen considered whether the queen ants' bodies could be enlarged to increase their reproductive output. Unfortunately, the genetic material Luo Wen controlled that could enhance body size primarily strengthened muscle structure or improved the oxygen supply system. While the latter provided some benefits, the muscle-enhancing genes merely increased muscle density and body size without improving the queen ants' reproductive organs. With no better solutions, Luo Wen had to rely on slow accumulation over time. Fortunately, the swarm encountered no significant adversaries during its advances. Several colonies of big-headed ants, once fierce rivals, were discovered recently. As history repeated itself, these regional overlords attempted to intercept the swarm's leaf-cutting units. When they responded by assembling armies of millions to retaliate, the tide had turned dramatically. This time, the swarm didn't retreat due to a disadvantage in numbers. What had once been a 2 million strong force had grown to 20 million. The massive army encircled and annihilated the big-headed ant armies, completely overwhelming them. While the swarm suffered over 1 million casualties, such losses were insignificant to a population exceeding 1 billion. The swarm had also begun spreading along the eastern shores of lakes and rivers. However, with insufficient resources, they had established only about 100 bases, serving as forward outposts. The situation across the river was similar to this side, as the two regions weren't far apart. The insects were mostly the same species, nothing noteworthy. In any case, once the swarm encountered them, they were recycled into protein. Meanwhile, the submersible bugs sent downstream had discovered several aquatic insect species. However, their abilities were unremarkable, offering Luo Wen no surprises. But as one door closes, another opens. Luo Wen received news from the Central Army. A 500,000 strong detachment had been wiped out by an unknown enemy. The accompanying queen ant, wisely refraining from advancing recklessly, had paused operations and dispatched messenger bugs to report to Luo Wen. Hearing this, Luo Wen wasn't angry, he was thrilled. Finally, a worthy opponent had surfaced. He wondered if they had any unique skills to showcase, setting the stage for an exciting exchange. At the same time, he marveled at the improved intelligence of the upgraded queen ants. They had learned to cater to his preferences, saving the most interesting challenges for him when they arose. Due to the Central Army's vast operational range and its population now exceeding 10 million, their pheromone markers were scattered chaotically along their path. Frustrated by the slow pace of the messenger bugs, Luo Wen set out alone. It took him until midday the next day to locate the Central Army's encampment, and that was only because he had a clear vantage point, otherwise, it might have taken much longer. The Central Army had strayed far from the front line, but Luo Wen no longer worried about traps or complete annihilation. The current era was different. No force could silently eliminate an army of millions without leaving any trace. Furthermore, the destroyed detachment had left enough evidence for the queen ant to detect signs of the enemy, indicating that while formidable, they weren't overwhelmingly powerful. Now that Luo Wen had arrived, speculation was pointless. He would soon see the situation for himself. Led by scout bugs, Luo Wen reached the site where the detachment had vanished. The area was saturated with chaotic pheromone signals, and scattered arthropod remains suggested insufficient meat to warrant cleanup. What puzzled Luo Wen were the numerous blackened, corrosive marks on the ground. They didn't resemble antacid burns but instead looked charred, with a lingering, pungent odor. This was unusual. Since his reincarnation, Luo Wen hadn't encountered fire. Had it been a local resident, they wouldn't even recognize these scorch marks. But for such traces to appear in a primitive environment was absurd. Everyone relied on melee combat, occasionally spraying acid. Who the hell was playing with fire now? That was going too far. Following these residual traces, Luo Wen soon found the culprit's lair. It was unmistakable, far more conspicuous than the big-headed ant colonies he had encountered before. It was a towering earthen fortress, about 20 meters high, standing taller than most nearby trees. Its presence was so striking that it couldn't be overlooked. Despite its height, the fortress had a small footprint, covering only a few square meters. From a distance, it resembled a rocket ready for launch or a corncob stuck in the ground. As Luo Wen got closer, he saw that the corncob was constructed from porous soil-like adhesive material. It appeared to be the work of a social insect species, possibly a new kind of ant. And their skills were extraordinary, enough to make Luo Wen's eyes light up with interest. However, they didn't seem too welcoming to a neighbor arriving to demand explanations. Luo Wen was already at their doorstep, yet no one came out to greet him. No matter. Luo Wen had plenty of experience when it came to knocking on doors. Chapter 85, Fart Bugs, 1. The corncob structure was particularly well suited to Luo Wen's method of knocking. He raised a pincer and jabbed it forcefully into the structure. Unexpectedly, the interior was hollow. Luo Wen's overzealous strike created a massive hole. Dirt crumbled from the walls in a cascade, leaving Luo Wen momentarily stunned. To avoid unnecessary conflict with his new neighbors, he decided to retreat for the time being. With his 8 long legs moving quickly, Luo Wen dashed 50 meters away in no time. Though one pair of legs had been slightly restructured, making them less effective on land, his overall speed remained unaffected. What lay hidden within the corncob was still a mystery, and Luo Wen thought it prudent to exercise caution. The dark opening in the mysterious structure loomed like a staring abyss, exuding an enigmatic allure. As time ticked by, a yellow cloud suddenly emerged from the hole. Upon closer inspection, the yellow cloud turned out to be a swarm of insects, each about 2 to 3 centimeters long. Their heads were amber-colored, while their thoraxes and abdomens faded to a pale yellow. They had mandibles at the front of their heads and resembled ants overall, yet something about them seemed off. After a moment of contemplation, Luo Wen realized the peculiarity: these insects' thoraxes and abdomens were fused into a single unit without visible segmentation. Having seen countless ant species with diverse traits and colors, Luo Wen knew that despite their variations, their body structures were typically consistent, with distinct head, thorax, and abdomen sections. More and more of the yellow cloud poured out of the hole, evidently enraged by the sudden damage to their home. In mere moments, the number of yellow bugs climbing out exceeded 200,000. Observing their familiar demeanor and reclusive tendencies, Luo Wen speculated that these creatures must have been cultivating something underground, either nurturing organisms or growing crops. Otherwise, there was no way such a large number of insects could emerge from a single nest. Such scenarios no longer surprised Luo Wen. After all, in this world, occupying territory required some unique skills. Waving his antennae, Luo Wen signaled to the hundreds of transport bugs behind him, which carried over 10,000 worker ants. They surged past him, charging toward the corncob. The worker ants raised their abdomens high and unleashed a barrage of ant acid as a welcome gift to the neighbors. Considering they had annihilated a 500,000 strong swarm detachment, a little payback seemed entirely justified. However, Luo Wen was taken aback by the effect or lack thereof of the acid attack. It wasn't that the damage was too severe but rather negligible. Noticing the gradient in their yellow shells, from deep to pale hues, Luo Wen mused, could the coloration indicate acid-resistant armor? If these creatures indeed possessed acid-resistant shells, it effectively neutralized the swarm's primary ranged attack method. In previous battles, the swarm's ranged acid firepower had significantly reduced casualties. It seemed this time, close combat would be unavoidable. Luo Wen waved his antennae, signaling a temporary retreat. 1 week later, due to the need to recalibrate unit composition after the failure of ranged attacks, additional time was spent mobilizing troops. Out of respect for the situation, Luo Wen gathered a force of 15 million. This was based on the precedent of the big-headed ants, who had cultivated 7 to 8 million soldiers underground. Assuming these new yellow bugs were also subterranean cultivators, their numbers were estimated to be in the millions. Luo Wen preemptively deployed twice their assumed strength and kept reinforcements on standby. Initially, Luo Wen considered employing tactics. However, every spy bug sent out was wiped out. He eventually discovered that these yellow bugs communicated not only through pheromones but also through sounds generated by tapping their heads or limbs against the ground. This was akin to humans speaking while simultaneously using sign language. The spy bugs understood one mode of communication but were clueless about the other, exposing them and leading to their demise. Frustrated and embarrassed, Luo Wen abandoned complex strategies in favor of brute force. The extra days spent mobilizing troops were largely due to this realization. For this direct confrontation, the swarm's composition shifted dramatically. Over 80% of the force consisted of soldier ants, while only a small number of worker ants accompanied them for post-battle cleanup. The massive army surrounded the corncob structure. Luo Wen stepped forward, raising his double pincers. He jabbed the structure repeatedly, creating 7 or 8 large holes from various angles before quickly retreating behind his troops. Moments later, a torrent of yellow bugs poured from the openings. While Luo Wen was ready for a direct confrontation, he wasn't about to wait for his foes to fully assemble. Waving his antennae, he commanded the army to attack, striking while the yellow bugs were still disorganized. The enemy lacked large combat units. While their smaller soldiers were ineffective against the swarm's larger ones, the latter excelled in executing swift, decisive strikes when supported by smaller units to distract and pin down enemies. Moreover, the yellow bugs were numerically disadvantaged, and many appeared to be worker ants. Facing the swarm's soldier ant-dominated force, they were quickly forced back toward the openings. However, bottlenecking the enemy at their entrances was inefficient and negated the swarm's numerical advantage. Under Luo Wen's command, the troops pulled back, allowing the yellow bugs to pour out in greater numbers. After several cycles of advance and retreat, the yellow bugs suffered heavy casualties. At this moment, larger insects with darker, tougher shells began crawling out of the nest. They resembled beetles more than ants. Each one raised its abdomen, assuming a posture Luo Wen found all too familiar. Focusing intently, Luo Wen realized the moment of talent demonstration had arrived. He wasn't about to miss this performance. With a chorus of pop, pop, pop sounds, thick smoke rose as if the creatures were passing gas. Their abdomens acted like shotguns, spraying an unknown liquid in all directions. These liquid pellets struck the swarm's soldier ants with blistering speed. Where they landed, blackened, corrosive burn marks appeared on the ants' carapaces, significantly weakening their combat ability. The unlucky ones died on the spot. Luo Wen's eyes lit up. The charred marks on the earlier battlefield had been caused by these insects. He had assumed their talent involved fire, but it turned out to be chemical weaponry instead. Accompanying their attacks was an overwhelming stench. If these bugs ever fought dogs, this trait alone would ensure their victory. This was utterly unsportsmanlike. Despite the drawbacks, Luo Wen was thrilled. The swarm was about to acquire a new ranged attack method. After all, even the yellow earth ants had acid-resistant armor. A future confrontation with the yellow earth ant legion was inevitable, and having more options in the swarm's arsenal could only be beneficial. Chapter 86, Fart Bugs, 2. Though the fart bugs' ranged firepower was impressive, causing significant casualties among the swarm's soldier ants, their attacks shared a limitation with ant acid, finite ammunition. Luo Wen observed carefully and noted that each fart bug could only fire 20 to 30 pops before running out of ammunition and retreating into the nest. Then, a new batch of fart bugs would emerge to take their place. Due to the corncob structure blocking his view, Luo Wen couldn't see what happened to the retreating bugs inside. As such, he couldn't determine how long it took them to reload. However, judging by the replenishment speed of ant acid, it was likely these bugs wouldn't have a chance to return to the battle in this engagement. Luo Wen wasn't certain how many more fart bugs were hidden within the nest, but with the swarm's population of over 1 billion, he felt confident. Even if the entire 15 million strong army was lost, it would only take a few days to deploy another wave of 15 million troops to the battlefield. The enemy's demonstrated abilities were impressive enough to justify further investment. And with the secrets they were hiding underground, be it livestock or crops, Luo Wen was sure he'd gain something valuable. Despite their formidable ranged support, the enemy lacked unit diversity, making their actual combat effectiveness comparable to the big-headed ants. After a full day of fighting, the enemy's reinforcements began to dwindle noticeably. By this time, the swarm still had at least 8 million combatants on the field. Half a day later, the enemy's bloated queen was dragged out of the nest and presented to Luo Wen. The queen resembled an enormous grub. While its head and upper body appeared relatively normal, its abdomen was grotesquely oversized, resembling a human with a regular upper body but a container-sized lower half. The massive, milky white abdomen hung awkwardly in front of the small queen's body, creating a laughable disparity. The disproportionate size rendered the queen immobile, with its 6 legs reduced to mere decorative appendages that didn't even touch the ground except when it awkwardly used them for feeding. Although the queen had lost mobility, its enormous abdomen granted unparalleled egg-laying capacity, something the swarm desperately needed. Luo Wen was both surprised and troubled by this unexpected windfall. First, its grotesque appearance was unappealing. Luo Wen had no qualms about eating creatures like spiders, but the sight of this wriggling, milky white grub made his stomach turn. Second, he was concerned about evolving its traits. If his desire to expand the swarm's population caused his instincts to misinterpret his intentions, and he woke up one day looking like that. Luo Wen shuddered at the thought. After much hesitation and finding no immediate solution, Luo Wen gritted his teeth, waved his antennae, and walked away. Shortly after, pieces of the queen's flesh were brought to him. The worker ants were not as squeamish as Luo Wen. In their minds, food was either edible or inedible, nothing more. Cautiously, Luo Wen tasted a few small pieces and nodded in satisfaction. If one overlooked its appearance, the flesh tasted quite good. It was tender and sticky, with a flavor reminiscent of white meat, blending a meaty aroma with a hint of creaminess. With the first problem solved, Luo Wen left the second to fate. After all, his instincts had learned his boundaries during the brood nest incident, so there was little reason to worry too much. While Luo Wen enjoyed his feast, the worker ants began dismantling the enemy nest to uncover its secrets. Because the expeditionary force included only a small number of worker ants and no burrower ants, the progress was painfully slow. The soldier ants refused to assist, considering such tasks beneath them. Luo Wen wasn't in a hurry. With nothing else pressing, he closed his eyes to rest after finishing his meal. Several hours later, reinforcements arrived at the front lines, including a large number of worker ants and burrower ants. Another day and night passed before the mysteries of the enemy's nest were fully revealed. The interior was similar to a big-headed ant colony, complete with farming techniques. However, instead of cultivating white fibrous fungal crops, they were growing something Luo Wen immediately recognized. Holy crap, are those mushrooms? Inside the underground chambers, decayed wood, leaves, and roots were scattered everywhere, serving as a bed for rows of tiny mushrooms. The long, white stems and small, grayish caps filled Luo Wen with a sense of nostalgia. Plucking a few, Luo Wen tasted them. The mushrooms were juicy and flavorful, no wonder they had nourished such a large army. They also appeared easier to cultivate than the white fungal crops, requiring only a layer of dried grass or other debris, not the meticulous care needed for fungal farming, where worker ants had to chew up leaves into mulch. It seemed mushrooms could be widely promoted for cultivation. However, the white fungus was still necessary, as it was Luo Wen's main source of sugar, and these mushrooms were not sweet. Other insects could always rely on aphid excretions for their sugar fix. That stuff was plenty sweet. Having uncovered the secret, there was no reason to linger. Luo Wen assigned a queen ant to temporarily take over the area, while the central army resumed its advance. Luo Wen began his journey back. Before leaving, he glanced back at the conspicuous corncob. This 20-meter-tall structure, with its unique material and excellent ventilation, served as both an entrance and a cooling system for the nest. Its design, however, was both unsightly and overly conspicuous. Luo Wen decided it wasn't yet time to overhaul the swarm's architecture, as they were still unfamiliar with the new crop's growth patterns and requirements. Shaking his head, Luo Wen resolved to revisit the matter later. Upon returning to the brood nest, Luo Wen uploaded the new genetic data. Despite their ant-like appearance, the genetic templates of these fart bugs were strikingly different. Their genes resembled those of beetles more than ants, which explained why they looked so similar to beetles. These were minor details, however. Luo Wen's primary goal now was to upgrade and optimize the queen ants, redistributing their roles and responsibilities more effectively. Chapter 87, The Grand Battle, 1. The new queen ants were divided into 3 types. The first type, the rarest, was designated for military campaigns, serving as commanders of the army. Since they were not required to lay eggs, their reproductive capabilities were minimized, and their musculature and body size were enhanced, slightly improving their mobility and self-preservation abilities. The second type of queen ant was the standard version previously utilized by the swarm. These were balanced in capabilities, capable of both laying eggs and retreating from bases or joining the army when necessary. They also made up the majority of the queen ant population. The third type of queen ant had been genetically modified with newly acquired genes, altering their abdominal egg-laying organs. By sacrificing mobility, they could produce a significantly greater quantity of eggs at a much faster rate. Consequently, these queens were stationed deep within the swarm's territory. Luo Wen planned to establish several breeding bases, each housing hundreds of this third type of queen ant to centralize larva production. They would mass-produce specific insect species according to Luo Wen's orders. For example, during peacetime, these queens primarily focused on breeding various worker ants. Once the larvae matured, they were transported throughout the territory. During wartime, however, these bases would become major staging points for deploying troops. Over the following weeks, the third type queen ants gradually matured, leading to an explosive growth in the swarm's numbers. Additionally, during this period, the swarm mastered the cultivation of mushrooms. This new crop could effectively clear dead branches and leaves in the territory. It grew easily, produced abundant yields, and had already been widely promoted. Meanwhile, instead of completely mimicking the architectural style of the yellow bugs, the swarm adopted the multi-vent design favored by big-headed ants for better heat dissipation. After several base experiments and observing one growth cycle, the mushrooms thrived without any issues and were further propagated. Hundreds of days passed, and the swarm's territory expanded by over 100 kilometers. The territory now housed more than 30,000 bases. In the later stages, the distances between bases grew significantly, far from the original state where dozens of bases occupied a few hundred square meters. Eventually, Luo Wen even reorganized the initial few thousand bases, leaving only a few hundred queen ants to manage them while reallocating the rest to oversee new territories. Although thousands of bases were left without queen ants, they weren't abandoned. The underground cultivation systems had become highly developed, allowing these bases to operate smoothly even without a queen. While the number of bases didn't increase significantly due to the limits of the brood nest's production capacity, the number of insects per base multiplied several times. On average, each base housed over 1 million insects of various types. Rough estimates indicated the swarm's total population exceeded 30 billion. With such a massive force, Luo Wen could no longer ignore a powerful enemy that had once severely injured him when he was weaker. It was time to confront them. Excited by the thought, Luo Wen was filled with anticipation. Revenge wasn't his primary motive, more importantly, he finally had something to look forward to. Unfortunately, it would take over 200 days for the Yellow Earth Ant Legion to reach the cliff again. Long ago, Luo Wen had stationed scout bugs permanently on the cliff. Through careful observation, he calculated that it took the Yellow Earth Ant Legion roughly 400 days to complete a hunting cycle. 100 days prior, the Yellow Earth Ant Legion had passed above the cliff. At that time, Luo Wen didn't entertain any thoughts about confronting them, feeling his strength was insufficient. However, he greatly underestimated the swarm's explosive growth rate. As the number of queen ants increased, the swarm's production capacity grew exponentially. In just over 100 days, Luo Wen's mindset shifted. At the current pace, by the time the Yellow Earth Ants returned, the swarm's population would likely reach 1 trillion. They could definitely take on the Yellow Earth Ant Legion head-on. As days dragged on, Luo Wen's anticipation made time feel unbearably slow, giving him a profound sense of watching grass grow. Finally, the Yellow Earth Ant Legion's return was only a few dozen days away, and the swarm began preparing for the imminent battle. An army marches on its stomach. Around a kilometer from the cliff, Luo Wen established several storage bases. Swarms of transport bugs moved back and forth, ferrying supplies from the territory to these locations. Nearby were several hatching bases, where millions of soldier ant eggs were incubating. By the time the battle commenced, these bases could provide tens of millions of reinforcements daily. 10 days before the calculated date, several armies began returning to the front. Bases farthest from the cliff also started deploying troops. As time passed, bases closer to the front dispatched their forces in waves. From above, one could see black columns of ants converging toward the cliff from all directions. According to Luo Wen's calculations, the swarm's forces would be fully assembled 3 days before the anticipated battle. After 200 days of development, the swarm's population had already surpassed 1 trillion. For this massive war, Luo Wen mobilized nearly every available insect. While ensuring the normal operation of farms and plantations in the territory, half the swarm over 500 billion insects was dispatched to the front lines. Even so, maintaining such a massive force was a heavy burden. Luo Wen planned for them to arrive 3 days early, as this was the limit of the swarm's logistical capabilities. However, 7 days before the anticipated date, scout bugs on the cliff detected the Yellow Earth Ant Legion's vanguard. Based on their pattern, the main army would arrive within 2 days at most. But half of the swarm's troops were still en route and would only be partially assembled by then. Unexpectedly, the Yellow Earth Ant Legion arrived earlier than anticipated. Fortunately, their early arrival wasn't by much, and Luo Wen had prepared for such contingencies. At least there was no longer any need to worry about food shortages. Once the battle began, the resulting carnage would provide ample sustenance. The pressing question was how to stall the Yellow Earth Ant Legion for 2 days. Before the 2 days were up, the Legion's main force had already arrived. Perhaps they sensed something amiss, as their vanguard had failed to report back for some time. The swarm's army, with its back to the cliff, stood ready. This time, the majority of the forces consisted of various soldier ants, as worker ants were of limited use against the Legion's acid-resistant armor. The Yellow Earth Ant Legion's predatory lifestyle underscored their aggressive nature. Upon spotting the swarm, they didn't hesitate. They launched into their signature leaping assault, charging forward. These creatures were the original source of the leaping gene template, and their mastery of this technique was second nature. Yet, the swarm's soldier ants were unafraid, meeting them with equally powerful leaps. The battle had officially begun. Chapter 88, The Grand Battle, 2. The Yellow Earth Ant Legion lacked large combat units, which put them at a disadvantage in close combat. While their larger ants were ineffective in one-on-one situations, their efficiency in group combat was astonishingly high. Moreover, the Yellow Earth Ants' hook mandibles were not particularly effective in battle. Hook soldier ants, which once held a third of the swarm's battlefield dominance, had gradually been phased out through continuous combat trials, leaving only a small number in service. This underscored that the swarm's soldier ants still had a notable advantage in close quarters combat. At the rear of the Yellow Earth Ants formation, many worker ants assumed a familiar posture, launching volleys of ant acid solution. This tactic had once caused Luo Wen immense trouble, but he later developed acid-resistant armor and equipped his entire army with it. Thus, this round of long-range firepower merely gave both sides a shower and polished their exoskeletons without any real effect. From the rear of the swarm's formation, massive black beetles emerged. Measuring 30 to 50 centimeters in length, they also assumed firing stances. As thick plumes of smoke rose, they launched salvos resembling shotgun blasts, spraying the Yellow Earth Ant ranks with liquid. This substance was not only highly corrosive but also extremely hot, inflicting devastating damage. Instantly, swathes of Yellow Earth Ants fell. Many more were burned or scalded, though they lacked pain receptors, their neural responses caused them to curl up and tremble, rendering them incapable of further combat. Luo Wen was extremely satisfied with the results. These specially designed war machines had exceeded his expectations, delivering an impressive performance in their first deployment. Initially, Luo Wen had intended to equip worker ants with a system similar to the acid spray mechanism. However, during implementation, he discovered that this new long-range strike system was incompatible with the worker ant's body structure. This system relied on 2 glands that secreted and stored different chemical substances. Beneath the glands was a chemical reaction chamber. The 2 chemicals would mix in this chamber, and the surrounding muscles could precisely control the dosage. Upon reaction, the mixture would be expelled immediately. The reaction generated temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius along with intense corrosive properties, inflicting both burns and corrosion on the enemy. The only drawback was that the discharge emitted thick white smoke and a noxious odor that lingered for over 10 days. Don't ask Luo Wen how he knew this so well, it was a memory he would rather forget. Because this system required several new organs, it demanded a spacious cavity for storage, which made it unsuitable for the small-bodied worker ants. As a result, Luo Wen retained the original templates but incorporated several genetic fragments, scaling up their size proportionally and enhancing their firepower and ammunition capacity. To prevent self-inflicted harm from these chemicals, the original templates also included a protective armor system to resist the high temperatures and corrosive effects. Luo Wen isolated and extracted this genetic sequence, equipping it on soldier ants. However, the older generation of queen ants lacked this genetic sequence, and many of the swarm's soldier ants were still from previous generations. Thus, only about 70% of the deployed forces were equipped with the new armor. This wasn't a significant issue. Soldier ants without the new armor were assigned to separate units, and they fought without long-range support. Even so, due to the secondary effects of the long-range firepower, even units equipped with protective armor avoided direct exposure to the black beetle's support fire. Otherwise, surviving soldiers would be exiled at least 800 miles away for half a month to recover. Despite both sides having hundreds of billions in reserves, the active battlefront spanned only 200 meters, with just tens of millions of combatants from both armies engaged in direct confrontation. The swarm's upgraded fart bugs, now larger versions, carried significantly more ammunition, capable of firing over 200 shots consecutively. Each salvo functioned like a shotgun blast. Hundreds of fart bugs unleashed their firepower with rapid pft, pft, pft sounds, mimicking the effect of a Vulcan Gatling gun though not with blue flames. The hallmark of a Gatling gun was its rapid fire rate, and the fart bugs didn't disappoint. Their ammunition reserves were expended in under a minute. These creatures were incredibly valuable. Their development cycle was lengthy, requiring complete metamorphosis and a molting process to reach their current size. Thus, they avoided melee combat. After exhausting their ammunition, they retreated to the rear for resupply, a process that would take 2 or 3 days due to their oversized ammunition chambers. Because of their specialized role, Luo Wen had produced only tens of thousands of fart bugs. Each one was to be deployed with precision. Organized into units of 500, the fart bugs were mobilized whenever the yellow earth ant density in a specific area exceeded a threshold, maximizing casualties. As the battle progressed, the battlefield expanded, and more insects joined the fray. 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, 500 million, a billion. After 5 hours, the war escalated to a scale involving 2 billion combatants. With its back to the cliff, the swarm continuously received reinforcements climbing up from below. The battlefront extended laterally, eventually reaching the lake to the east under Luo Wen's deliberate guidance. At this point, dark yellow, pancake-shaped bugs entered the battlefield. These were a new species Luo Wen had discovered recently in certain ant nests. They were fascinating creatures, epitomizing defense to the extreme. Their backs were covered with oval, leather-like shields that resisted cutting, piercing, and other physical attacks effectively. They also boasted impressive resistance to corrosion and acid. Underneath the shield was a recessed cavity where the bug's body was hidden. Due to this recess, these bugs had incredibly low ground clearance. When crawling, there was only a 1 to 2 mm gap between the shield and the ground. This height prevented most ants from crawling underneath. Even the tiniest ants, measuring mere millimeters, were no match for these bugs. Additionally, their size and weight made it impossible for ants to overturn them. Their survival strategy relied on their invincible defense. They would brute force their way into ant nests, feasting and living freely, while the ants were powerless to stop them. These creatures were true brutes, unlike the spy bugs of the past, whose methods involved finesse. Chapter 89, The Grand Battle, 3. Unfortunately, these pancake bugs could only bully ant colonies lacking massive combat units like the ultra-giant soldier ants. Once the ant colony they parasitized was overrun by the swarm, they could only contribute their genes to the collective. The original pancake bugs were only about 7-8 centimeters in length, but the ones appearing on the battlefield were results of Luo Wen's genetic modifications. In his free time, Luo Wen had used their genetic template and added genes for increased size, enlarging them to around 30 centimeters. Due to their large appetites and refusal to perform any labor, only about 100 of them were produced. Originally, Luo Wen intended to use them as flatbed carts for strategic relocation of the brood nest if the battle with the Yellow Earth Ant Legion went poorly. However, upon seeing the battlefield near the waterfall, Luo Wen had a sudden inspiration and dispatched 50 pancake bugs to the front. Since the brood nest had only been relocated once, it was positioned quite close to the cliff, making it relatively near to the battlefield. Thankfully, despite their slow movement, the pancake bugs managed to crawl to the battlefield within a few hours. Had the distance been greater, they would have arrived too late long after the battle had ended. Given their physical structure, the pancake bugs would never have reached the cliff on their own. Fortunately, they had allies. With their dense shields, each pancake bug was so heavy it required 7 or 8 transport bugs to haul it up the cliff. Once on the battlefield, the 50 pancake bugs meandered across the battlefield, ignoring all attacks from the yellow earth ants. After circling the enemy forces, they headed toward the lake above the cliff. By this point, their shields were covered with yellow earth ants futilely gnawing at them. Reaching the edge of the cliff above the lake, the pancake bugs did not stop. They continued moving forward until they plunged over the edge, dragging their attackers with them. Thud! 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 A series of heavy splashes sent water spraying into the air, creating ripples across the lake. Neither the pancake bugs nor the yellow earth ants had learned how to swim. After falling into the water, the lighter yellow earth ants struggled at the surface, while the pancake bugs immediately sank toward the lake bed. However, the pancake bugs had allies. Submersible bugs lying in wait pulled them out of the water. With assistance from raft bugs, they were ferried back to shore. As for the yellow earth ants, they became a feast for the aquatic insects. The pancake bugs were then hauled back up the cliff by transport bugs and re-entered the battlefield to repeat their performance, dragging another batch of yellow earth ants into the water. Up the cliff, into the battlefield, down to the water. Each cycle eliminated roughly 5,000 yellow earth ants. While this number was insignificant compared to the billions on the battlefield, the method was low cost. Pancake bugs, with their tough hides, suffered little damage even after soaking in water. Moreover, the aquatic insects relished the opportunity to participate in the battle, making it a win-win strategy. The battlefield became a massive grindstone, relentlessly pulverizing the soldiers of both sides. 2 days later, the battlefront had stretched nearly 10 kilometers, with over 2 billion insects locked in relentless combat day and night. On the Yellow Earth Ant Legion's side, columns of reinforcements continued to flood the battlefield. On the swarm's side, however, 2 days of continuous fighting had taken a toll. The soldier ants had rotated through multiple waves, but the unending battles left the survivors utterly exhausted. Apart from the dead, the remaining ants were on the verge of collapse. Fortunately, reinforcements were finally about to arrive. Half a day later, fresh forces began to trickle in. Without time for rest, they were immediately deployed, replacing the exhausted units. The arrival of new troops, combined with the replenished firepower of the fart bugs, gave the swarm a momentary resurgence. They pushed the battlefront several meters toward the yellow earth ants. Seizing the opportunity, worker ants rushed forward to clear the battlefield of corpses. These were valuable resources and supplies. Whether the armies could sustain themselves depended on who claimed the most. However, as both armies depleted their forces, the number of corpses grew so vast that they ceased to be contested. The abundance of food now exceeded the number of surviving soldiers. During this phase, the Yellow Earth Ant Legion leveraged their superior numbers, maintaining pressure on the swarm. Even when the swarm launched counterattacks supported by the fart bugs, the Yellow Earth Ants quickly regained the upper hand. Luo Wen realized he had underestimated the Yellow Earth Ant Legion's potential for warfare and their sheer numbers. If given another chance, he would have chosen to wait out another cycle. By then, the swarm would have easily overwhelmed them. But the path had been chosen, and the consequences were his to bear. No matter how dire the situation, he resolved to persevere. After 9 days of battle, the situation was grim. Luo Wen ordered the evacuation of all brood nests and queen ants within 5 kilometers of the cliff. By the 13th day, he began mobilizing worker ants from surrounding bases to the battlefield, even at the cost of abandoning thousands of bases. On the 15th day of combat, the intensity of the battle reached its peak and began to wane. The Yellow Earth Ant Legion showed signs of exhaustion. The number of soldier ants on the front line visibly decreased, replaced by large numbers of worker ants. Luo Wen glimpsed a glimmer of victory. Before the battle began, the swarm's breeding bases had been operating at full capacity. Now, a steady flow of mature soldier ants bolstered the front line daily. This was the longest and most grueling battle the swarm had fought since its inception. Many hidden shortcomings had been exposed, particularly in troop production. While the swarm could lay eggs rapidly, the time required for larvae to mature was still too long. Currently, Luo Wen relied on his foresight to prepare for battles, ensuring ample production of soldier ants in advance. But under normal circumstances, the swarm didn't maintain such a high number of combat units, which were non-productive during peacetime. Without solving the resource issue, this model couldn't be sustained in the long term. If a sudden enemy invasion struck the swarm, they might fail to hatch sufficient troops in time, risking the loss of key deployment points and creating a vicious cycle. Thus, Luo Wen resolved that when the time came, he would find a way to shorten the maturation process for his insects. For now, his sole focus was to win this battle. Chapter 90, The Grand Battle, 4. The battlefield was now a mountainous heap of insect corpses. Yellow and black bodies were tangled together in chaotic piles, which had not been cleared for quite some time. Amidst this mountain of death, fierce battles raged on. From afar, it was impossible to distinguish the living from the dead in the endless mass of insects. This was the 18th day of the battle. The battlefield was now largely devoid of yellow earth ant soldier ants, and the swarm's soldier ants had long since been expended. The swarm had been holding the line with millions of newly hatched soldier ant reinforcements each day, supplemented by large numbers of worker ants. As the enemy's soldier ants dwindled, the swarm's advantage of producing millions of new soldier ants daily became increasingly evident. The main combatants evolved over time. At first, it was soldier ants versus soldier ants. Then, soldier ants versus soldier ants and worker ants. Later, soldier ants and worker ants versus worker ants and a few soldier ants. Finally, worker ants versus worker ants and soldier ants. Yet, as the war continued, the number of the swarm's soldier ants steadily increased. The swarm's robust logistics and endurance shone in this moment. 3 days later, the endless tide of yellow earth ants had finally thinned to the point where its edges could be seen. Victory was within sight. Luo Wen was thrilled. And since his wool was the swarm's wool, his motivation served as a rallying cry for the swarm to press onward. Invigorated by Luo Wen's resolve, the swarm intensified its counter-offensive with the help of fully reloaded fart bugs. Simultaneously, all nearby transport bugs were conscripted into the battle to join the fight. This war had dragged on long enough, it was time to end it. Under the swarm's relentless assault, the battle continued for another 2 days. Ultimately, the swarm emerged victorious. The Yellow Earth Ant Legion, which had ravaged the desert, was utterly eradicated. Post-battle statistics. The Great Battle had lasted 23 days. On this meat-grinder battlefield, the losses of combat units on both sides were incalculable. Luo Wen knew, however, that the swarm's initial force of 50 billion had been nearly annihilated. Additional worker ant reinforcements had also suffered heavy casualties, and the supplementary soldier ants sustained significant losses. Altogether, the swarm lost close to 90 billion units. This meant the war had wiped out nearly 90% of the swarm's population, leaving many bases abandoned due to a lack of maintenance. However, the swarm's queen ants remained completely unharmed. Looking at the 10-kilometer-long corpse mountain, with an average height of over 10 meters, Luo Wen felt a measure of solace. Once the queen ants digested these spoils, the swarm would emerge even stronger. Furthermore, the desert atop the cliff would become the swarm's backyard. The yellow earth ants' former hunting grounds were now swarm territory. This was a massive expanse, requiring over 400 days to traverse in a full hunting cycle. It was at least 100 times larger than the swarm's original domain, a size Luo Wen couldn't even fathom. Reflecting on his journey, Luo Wen recalled how he had first encountered the yellow earth ants shortly after hatching. After being swept away by a sandstorm, he drifted an unknown distance and then traveled along an underground river for what seemed like forever, only to still remain within their hunting grounds. These memories underscored the immense scale of the territory. Though the land appeared to be a barren desert, it clearly held hidden resources. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to sustain the massive Yellow Earth Ant Legion, which had likely suffered losses exceeding 1 trillion in this war. Beyond territory and corpses, Luo Wen also gained other rewards. Near the core of the Yellow Earth Ant formation, the swarm discovered thousands of queen ants. These queens had accompanied the army, hunting and replenishing food supplies. Once enough food was accumulated, they would remain stationary to lay large batches of eggs. Once the eggs matured, the army would march onward. The genes of these queens would significantly enhance the productivity of the swarm's own queen ants. With the swarm's vast reserves of food, there was no need to delay in utilizing this advantage. Additionally, the yellow earth ants harbored another species of insect, essentially livestock. These creatures, about 20 centimeters long, resembled oversized larvae without any exoskeleton. Their defining feature was their exceptional efficiency in converting food into body mass, with a 90% conversion rate. When the yellow earth ants had surplus food, they would feed it to these creatures. During times of scarcity, they would consume them in turn. Though these unfortunate insects had potential, they seemed to have no practical use for the swarm at present. Luo Wen deemed them unnecessary for production. With this massive war finally over, Luo Wen felt immense relief. The grudge he had held since his early days was finally settled. However, he was slightly disappointed that no dramatic epiphany or transcendence occurred, as it might in a novel. After 20 days of war, Luo Wen, though not directly involved in combat, was mentally exhausted. After arranging post-war tasks, he chose a random spot beneath the cliff and fell into a deep sleep. This area, once the war's front line, was now deep within swarm territory. Luo Wen slept soundly. When he awoke, he had no idea how much time had passed. In this world, he alone seemed to grasp the concept of time. The mountain of corpses atop the cliff had partially disappeared, the remains having been transported to bases for burial near production sites. The queen ants at these sites had been given new orders before Luo Wen slept, halt soldier ant production and prioritize worker ants. With 200-300 million soldier ants remaining and no immediate plans for exploration, this was sufficient to defend the current territory. The primary task now was to replenish worker ants and restore normal operations across the bases. Returning to the brood nest, Luo Wen connected to it, uploading new genetic fragments and updating the gene bank for the queen ants. He cancelled the old queen ant production orders and began hatching the new generation queens. Luo Wen stumbled upon an unexpected boon. The seemingly useless livestock genes turned out to accelerate nutrient absorption, shortening insect maturation times. Although the insects still had to go through the egg larva pupa adult stages, their growth cycles could now be reduced by 1/3. For example, insects that once required 30 days to mature could now do so in just 20 days. A weakness exposed during the war had been resolved far sooner than Luo Wen expected. While it still fell short of his ultimate goal, it was a significant step forward. Finally, during his connection with the brood nest, Luo Wen received vague information about a potential opportunity, a sign of something greater to come.